Thanks for being here, and I'm going to talk about something probably that may look very far away from your practice, but somewhat as practitioners who use the mind as a model to, or try to conceptualize the mind to work with patients, it's important to try to come back to a theoretical understanding of your own practice. And so just imagine that you are in another room listening maybe to a talk from a neuroscientist and somebody interested in artificial intelligence. You will hear about robots here, so that may seem far. But I think that the theoretical content of what I'm going to talk about is highly relevant to some of what you do. So, I'm David Rudrauf. I'm a psychologist initially and a neuroscientist. I worked with Francisco Varela and Antonio Damasio. Spent 8 years in the US, and now, as I have been presented, I'm here as an associate professor. My research interests are in integration of cognitive functions, consciousness, emotion, computational model of the mind, and resilience of cognition. But I have been taken to resilience not through psychology, but through neurology. And on the neuroscience side, kind of as a parallel, I'm interested in large-scale integration and routing in the brain, in the neural networks, and in particular, in structure-function relationships. And as I said, some of what I'm going to present here derives from principles that have been proposed by Francisco Varela in neurophenomenology, in which we consider that somewhat modeling subjective experience in an accurate way is as important as understanding the brain itself to understand the brain. Because if you have understood the object you are trying to study, you know immediately what hypothesis you can formulate and what to look for into the brain. So psychology has a great place in the future, I hope so, for neuroscience, and not just the contrary. So it's somewhat something we could call formal psychological theory that I'm developing with a group of international collaborators. My aim here, of course, it's an ambitious and impossible goal, but we can have ambitious goals and just do a few steps, is to try to render explicit, let's say, the global formal structure of the mind and subjective consciousness. It's a hard problem. There is an explanatory gap. How could we relate, human experience and the equation of physics, for instance? Seems very far-fetched. So in a way, we are asking the question of the status of the mind with respect to materiality. The brain is a system that is embedded in an autonomous agent that we are somewhat. It's embodied. It's massively parallel. A lot of neurons, a lot of networks that are parallel. It's massively connected to sensors, or eyes, or the sensors in your skins that inform us about various things. And actuators, the way I control my body, my heart, I regulate things. Things are changing alone. And it has to be high speed in some ways, energy efficient, and it's kind of utility oriented. We have to behave, we have to learn how to navigate in this world, in this epic ocean. And as I said, it's not something that exists outside of an individual who is engaged into the world. And the brain has to solve a lot of problems of integration of information with all these flows of signals that come in, which somewhat is about routing, finding a pathway, the right pathway for information to be integrated. And this is important to support timely perception, imagination, and action planning. So, when we learn about the brain in textbook, we learn about structure-function relationship. We have a visual system. We have a lot of things that are more or less specialized functionally. But the reality of clinics in neurology teach you, of course, that there is a huge departure, a strong variability with respect to this model. And this is where I started to think about resilience, which we can express here as a dynamical preservation of function under a regime of perturbation, for instance, a lesion, a hole in the brain, which actually indicate that there are complex structure-function relationships between, for instance, the anatomy of the brain and the functions of our mind. It obviously complicates then the reflection on an anatomo-functional model. You know, if the relationship between the brain system and its function is not that clear, we have a problem. And nevertheless, it's very prevalent in neurology and neuropsychiatry. It's a major question for public health and preventive medicine, and it's a window on the relationship between the mind and the brain. At least I'd argue. So I'm going to show you a few cases that are kind of prototypical exemplars of what we encounter. Incidental finding, he did not consult a neurologist. It's a dramatic developmental case with an enlargement of the ventricles due to hydrocephaly that basically crushed the white matter and the cerebral cortex on the side. And this individual who has a very, very strange and abnormal brain, well, he's married, he was at the time of the study 44-year-old, he's a father of 2 and a public officer, and nobody thought that he had brain damage until they found it. There are cases that are even more puzzling and highly debated those days because of societal issues and questions, which are cases of persistent vegetative states, people that we think are totally non-communicating. I mean, they are clinically. They may be close to coma. They have had terrible trauma that's really, really affected at the large scale their brain, either a car accident or some metabolic disease that really destroyed the brain at the large scale. So for most of, we think that those patients are just like not conscious. Some people in Liège, the team of Stephen Lorries, did some challenging experiments, betting that maybe actually some of them were aware. So they asked them to do tasks of mental imagery, play tennis, or imagine that you're walking in your apartment. And because we can dissociate that with brain imaging, because the pattern of activation that we can record during those mental imagery tasks are very different and reliably different, they used that to see if they were able to do the task. And then to go further, when they found out that indeed the patterns were similar and consistent, they used that as a way to code questions. So if you want to say yes, think about playing tennis. And if you want to say no, think about walking in your apartment. And when they did that, they asked autobiographical questions. Is the name of your father X or Y? And they got in some of the patients 100% correct response. And what we know is that when people recover from persistent vegetative states and progressively come back to consciousness and eventually have the mean of being treated and rehabilitated by interacting with clinicians, it is absolutely key for them to have a sense of themselves, to be able to understand a bit others, to have a form of awareness so that they can work willfully with people, of course, with clinicians. So here you can see even at this point, from the transition of, let's call it coma, to full-fledged self-awareness or awareness, the mere fact of regaining consciousness, it seems obvious, is a necessary condition for the clinician to work with them. And this is not a trivial fact. We'll talk more about that. And this is also something we see somewhat in neurodegenerative disease, such as Alzheimer's disease, which of course is a terrible slop. But some people handle it much better with the same level of atrophy, metabolic failure, and disconnection. 2 individuals will really behave differently. Some will be completely demented. Others will actually be very resilient. And this is interacting with education, social activity, IQ, a lot of things that have to do with integrative process of the mind, either cognitively or socially. And of course, that's jump along. But we see that also, and this is why I say be careful when you open a manual, a textbook in neuroscience. Things are more complicated than we wish they would. About certain theories, for instance, the implication of the insular cortex as a critical region or for interoceptive awareness, the sense of the inner body, emotional experience, when you feel you're angry, for instance, self-recognition in pictures, all the aspects of self-awareness, name them. Some people think without this structure, you would be a zombie. Well, it happens that we had a patient that had a terrible disease, but nevertheless had lesions that were bilateral of these structures. including all or many other structures of the limbic system, the anterior cingulate and other structures. Not necessarily that I detail them, but understand that people thought they were radically necessary for this process. I'm not going to detail those experiments, but just let me tell you, interoceptive awareness that we manipulated with pharmacology by inducing increase of heart rate was largely preserved in this patient. Emotion and pain with cold pressor, we put, the hand of the patient into a cold water bucket, and this is very painful but innocuous. And he had all the reactions, behavioral, subjective, physiological, that we would expect from the experience of pain. The sense of agentivity. He was perfectly aware that he was the agent of his actions in simple experimental protocol, contrary to what some people said there would happen. And also in terms of personality bias, the positivity bias, we all think that, oh yeah, I'm realistic and warm. No, I'm not realistic and cold. But since we all think that, we must be wrong because we say the contrary of others. This guy is irrealistic. So there is here some problem of conceptualization of ourselves in the world that is like fundamental and exists in this patient too the same manner. So when we take this patient and we go into some sort of inquiry that is more philosophical and let's say epistemological, and we ask him questions like, what does it mean to have a sense of self? You might say, why are you asking the question? Just to give you well, it's an idea of your own personality and place in society. This is a man who lacked about 35% of his brain. How do you know that you have a sense of self? I know who I am, what I need, how to survive. I am surviving and thriving. This notion of effort, or having to fight, the epic struggle on this boat we are all in, the Homeric landscape we were talking about earlier. Let's not forget that that's also a reality. And that being resilient is indeed also being capable of facing the real world, the big world. Do you think that the sense of self depends on the existence of the body? No, because you can lose different parts of the body and you are still the same. That's right, he tricked us. How much of your body would you have to lose your sense of self? The brain. Okay, we got that. If you had to describe to somebody what it is like to be you, what would you say? And this is a man that a very prominent neuroscientist said, a guy with lesion like that would be a zombie. A normal person with a bad memory. He has a very strong anterograde amnesia related to bilateral hippocampic damage, which is one of the rare things that is kind of cause systematic impairment that are reliably and durable, that cannot really be compensated. Are you aware that I'm aware? I am aware that you are aware that I'm aware. Did he answer? And that was actually the next question. We did this questionnaire, it's only a part with philosophers. So here, this is the important part. We are talking about conditions in which the backbone, the structural backbone, the anatomy of the brain is so messed up, damaged, and irreversibly that there is no hope that plasticity, in the sense of a structural reconstruction of the pathways, could actually restore completely and fully the organization of a normal brain. So that means that these functions are preserved in spite of this, and that there are some form of degrees of freedom in structure-function relationships that leave rooms for reorganization. And they must have some rules. This would be interesting to understand then. So this is not a theory, but for instance, these are patients without corpus callosum, the white matter pathways, the bundle of white matter pathways that link the two hemispheres. And nevertheless, there are bilateral resting state networks that we measure with functional imaging, contrary to all what computational model, generative model, would have let us expect. So something happens, and the brain is capable of transferring some of its computation, of its processing, reorganizing, not necessarily structurally, but functionally, in spite of very, very huge roadblock in terms of the wiring diagram. And there are evidence also in patients that have had brain injuries and with motor syndromes and that do some re-education protocol or therapy that, and I'm not going to enter in the detail of those matrices, but basically that at the beginning, the functional connectivity, that is the the connectivity we measure in terms of how the brain oscillates and is correlated or not, which is not necessarily related to direct physical connection, but they interact somewhat, and we can measure that functionally. This functional connectivity actually recovers progressively to kind of showing patterns of renormalization. It starts looking similar for the part of the brain that are spared to what you would observe in patients, in people that do not have that type of brain damage, even though at the beginning it seems completely chaotic. So here something is happening in terms of function that involves a reorganization that is functional without necessarily a reorganization that is anatomical. So we can formulate many hypotheses about mechanism, and I'm not going to enter into some of the details, but you know, if you have two regions of the brain that interact for fulfilling some function, like vision, to simplify, and all of a sudden you have an accident, and the physical pathways that connect those two regions that are working together now are gone. Well, if there are other indirect connection, by a reweighting of those pathways, for instance, the neurons that are intermediary, by changing the synaptic gains and allowing the signal to be rerouted, we might be able to actually, and this is probably what happens, that's one of the hypotheses, to reorganize communication so that, you know, distributed systems can again function and implement those functions, even though it has changed physically. But how do we do that? Of course, there are a lot of bottom-up systems and mechanism, biochemical, synaptic. But there is a problem here. There is a problem of how globally you control this routing problem. And when you go into computer science and microelectronics, you understand that you don't deal with distributed systems just with hardware. You need a good software that is dealing with the algorithm of routing the information, you know, so that it's actually efficient, it doesn't overburden the system. So here is the room for, again, a thinking about algorithmic relationships that are not purely structural and that are really computational, and nevertheless mediate the structural reorganization or functional reorganization at the lowest level of the brain. And as I emphasized before, consciousness is very important, and self-awareness in voluntary rehabilitation. For instance, patients with anosognosia who are unaware of some of their deficits, it's much harder for them to be resilient. It's much harder for the clinician to work with them. And part of the job sometimes is to actually make them become aware of their deficit. Once you have reached that stage, it's a better work to start. So if you want to think about, in a grand scheme of things, consciousness, and you acknowledge that there are, you know, bottom-up mechanisms in which the willful collaboration of the patient, its own integration of information, understanding of its own case, and knowledge about its deficit is key, alors maybe we can make a sweeping hypothesis. Consciousness may have been a robust algorithm. Remember, it's very hard to destroy consciousness. You really need to destroy the brain very large scale. And even then, remember the PVS case. You may have residual consciousness. It's one of the, you can lose your sight, you can lose your ear, you can lose your memory, you can lose your language. But the basic subjective sense, although it can be very altered, seems to be very, very resistant. Just as if consciousness was a robust algorithm for resilience. And if you ask yourself, what is the function of consciousness? Well, if you think about it intuitively, like, it's the old Greek motto, gnote theoton, know thyself. And by knowing thyself, you may cope with the Homeric epics that is awaiting you in this world. So if all what I said is somewhat true, that means that we have to conceive of structure-function relationships in a different manner than what classical neuroscience wants to do at a purely biological level. We may have to rethink about the connection between the brain and the mind in a more computational framework, in which somewhat the mind is this sort of virtual workspace. Why virtual? It comes from a concept from computer science. You know, you are all used to use computers and to find your file just by clicking on a folder, even though this folder may actually point to very complex and distributed hard drive that are, there is a lot of software behind for making things easy for you. When you control your body, when I think about pushing this button, I don't think about all the neurons and the muscle I need to push. There is something, there is a gap here. that has been virtualized. Virtualization is about hiding the complexity of the hardware to permit, to allow the agent to operate and control a complex systems like the biomechanics of a body more easily and more resiliently. Because with virtualization, you can move things around. It's okay if this server is gone. We can just readapt. There are other servers. But we have the rules, the algorithmic rules to move things around. So the question, is there something like that in the mind? And what can we learn about it? Well, I'm just starting to think about it. Did I start like 5 minutes late? So I can, okay. Because maybe I'll give you another talk at some point. So maybe you have heard about those models, qualitative model of consciousness in terms of global neuronal workspace from Stanislas Dehaene. Basically, you have a system that is a central integrator, but that is distributed. And a lot of guys like Vision, Audition, try to get in, to have their say, to have their words. And they are in competition, and they need to speak loud enough so that they enter in your consciousness. You need to have enough gain. For instance, if you look at a visual stimulus, to give a very trivial example, you need a minimum amount of contrast to see it. You need a minimum of energy. But this all started with kind of a psychological theory that somewhat conceive of the mind as a sort of theater. We are the observer sitting in the theater and looking at the stage. And some people have criticized this model as something like epistemologically problematic and circular, the Cartesian theater, in which you would have this attentional beam. We talked about this beam, that would allow you to focus on things, not necessarily by looking. I can think about what is here without looking at it. So it's not a visual thing. This spatial cognition is not a visual thing. And it's a supramodal workspace in the sense that, again, the spatial cognition or cognition in this theater is broader than the visual field. I have eyes in my back. It's something that we use the ear also to locate things in space. You can close your eyes and the acoustics of the environment is going to tell you a lot about what is on you. And blind people are a testimony that has nothing to do with vision. Vision is actually subordinated by that, to that. We use our sense to feed this system that is somewhat at a higher level, that opportunistically and resiliently will pick up visual information here, auditory information here, and proprioceptive information there. And if the vision is not available because there is a wall or I'm blind, I'm going to use something else. So it's a system that is supramodal in the sense that is beyond any sensory modality. And again, it's important, because all that seems very abstract, not to forget that it's actually in a physical system that is embodied and that has to deal with the reality of this world through cycles of perception, I see you, prediction, what do they think of me, and action, I'm going to just leave. And to satisfy prior belief that can be cast as a utility function. I don't want to be disloved. I like attention. These kind of things, those priors that we have in mind that make us act, that can be unconscious or conscious. And sensory information, for most of it, doesn't arrive to our sensory organ in a spatially labeled manner. It's an inference that we make. We have to solve somewhat, if you think about the retina, we get mostly spatial projection in 2D, and nevertheless, I built a representation of the world in 3D. It's a very complex inverse problem that I have to do, because in fact, the information that I have is very partial. One of our hypotheses is that this space and its frame has a very specific geometry. There is a selective pressure to incorporate spatial representation, physical and social, of the self and of its relation with object and other agent, for perception, prediction, and action. Obviously, when you have to lure your predator, you'd rather understand how he may see you, how he may react. You have to have somewhat of a minimal theory of mind. And of course, this is all something that we all know in mirrors and in the time we spent being obsessed with our own image, for instance, where obviously there's a lot of things that have to do with perspective taking, spatial imagination of how I would look like from a certain angle, etc., etc. So from there, our theory, which actually is starting here, so I'm going to go very fast, is that this supramodal global workspace is built upon two components: an active inference engine and a projective geometry engine that are coupled together to integrate information, notably through language and emotion. Component number one, the mind is an inference machine. In perception, when you wander there because you cannot see very well, is it a bird over there? In emotion, in imagination, does he really love me? Does she really love me? Why didn't he come back? All this mentalization and wondering about things we cannot really know, dealing with uncertainty, ambiguity, and conflict. And we have to make biased bet. We are no God. I'm not in your head. So it's all inference. And that's part of the difficulty, being good at this inference, at understanding the other. And I'd say that a lot of scientific and philosophical questions comes down to the same type of problem. It's about inference. How do we start by having a subjectivity, ignorant, limited in its own world, and make inference about what is beyond us? That's the whole problem. And there are, and don't worry about the question, but there are now formal frameworks that allow us to start building machines that do that, robots, or understanding psychology and make predictions that are very accurate about how people will behave, which is basically Bayesian inference. You may have heard about it. And without entering into details, this is basically what it is about. How do you combine internal model, priors that you have about the world? It's good to be loved. How is it? How does love manifest? Well, he or she is around. They are looking at me. All of that are kind of internal model that you have in your mind, maybe, or I do, and you probably have your own, and you use them to interpret the world. Without them, you would be completely lost. The tabula rasa of empiricism is just incompatible with what we are. We need to build progressively internal model, and we make inference about things. You know that. And on top of that, we make it often actively. You know, there are many ways of dealing with questions. We can either face them or avoid them. And this framework is great because it allows you to actually model autonomous systems that, you know, perceive, interpret, and act. And because of this importance of priors in those models, actually those systems, sometimes they will actually face reality because their goal is to kind of learn about the world, minimize the uncertainty that manifests as a free energy. And, but sometimes they will rather turn their back on things. You know, if you don't want to revise the model that you have inside of you about the world, yourself, and others, you may just want to move around to find confirmation of what you want. For instance, if you are criticized, instead of staying in the room and facing the critics, you can leave the room. There is no critics no more. Why do I worry? Knows that now science has made some progress, and we start being capable of actually handling those things mathematically and computationally, and using them to build machines that someday may replace us, who knows. Component number two, projective geometry. And I think this is a key part for all what we have understood, we have heard about today. It's basically the mathematics of the observer. Don't we need precisely a theory of the observer here? When we talk so much about perspective taking? Or is it to see through the eyes of the mother or through, you know, the imagination of whoever? Well, actually, there is a mathematics that exists has started to exist a long time ago, which is projective geometry, which was initially formally derived in the context of the emergence of perspective in art and architecture. And our hypothesis is that the subjective frame is a 3D projective frame, and the global workspace is ruled by projective geometry. I don't have much time, so I'm going to just give you a few hints. We have some phenomenological postulates. You don't have to acknowledge them. Those are postulates. That's the great thing about science. We can postulate things that we are not sure of and see where that leads us. Our subjective awareness of ourselves and the world is 3D. It's fundamentally three-dimensional. We have kind of a default egocentric perspective on the world. I see you from my point, and I look at you as, you know, being away from me. But we can take by imagination any allocentric standpoint. I can imagine, perhaps, more or less accurately, how is it to look at me from there? It's very key, this aiming, this intentional process. we have also a native sense of directions. I have a sense of what is front, of what is up, of what is back. That's non-trivial. And this is where maybe the most contentious point. We build an horizon at infinity. That is like, it's obvious in vision. You see the railroad, they converge toward vanishing point. We have this horizon, we have this sphere on us that somewhat put on the map something that would be infinity. And I would argue we do the same in imagination. If you imagine a cube and you imagine it going farther away, I would bet that most of you will see the cube, will imagine the cube as becoming smaller and smaller until it vanishes at infinity. And that's the way you represent distance in part. And objects and relations are expressed as 3D spatial projection. That's what I do. I see you as 3D object. And we have relation of incidence. And if I can model that, I have a model. So if you take those postulates, actually there is one mathematical space model that comes out automatically. It's like a consequence of those postulates, and which yield us to hypothesize that the global workspace has the structure of a projective 3 space. A projective space in 3 dimensions. It's no Euclidean space. It's a very bizarre geometry. And then, if that's the case, if it's projective geometry, I can indeed understand all possible transformation of point of view and relationship. I can imagine myself jumping to the moon. I can think about, oh my God, I have been so bad in front of this audience and remember all the things I have said, see myself sweating, being anxious. Not really the case, but that could have been. And that will like obsess me. And when I do that, I make little movies in my head. Well, movies are based on projective geometry. Cameras are based on projective geometry. The mathematical theory of that is projective geometry. It's just projective transformation. And actually, by combining projective geometry and active inference, we can actually computationally infer any space, be it fantasist. I sample a bit of that, I sample a bit of that, and progressively in my memory, I build a representation of this space that I access consciously, projectively, as some sort of field in perspective. And that's not trivial. It has an evolutionary origin because there are birds that actually use projective geometry to impress, to look bigger than they are, to impress their female by forcing perspective on them. And apparently that promotes mating success. And I think our contemporary societies are a good illustration of how wild projective geometry has taken over us, with this obsession for cameras and things like that. Should I stop? Do I have 2 minutes? We can redefine perception, imagination, and action programming based on that. Perception, indeed, come down to a subset of all possible transformation in projective geometry. These are the ones, basically, that are attached to my body. It's like I have a little camera or a little beam on my head or somewhere in my mind. And basically, I don't perceive through your eyes. I can imagine your eyes, but I don't. So the projective transformation that allows me to kind of make this inference about 3D space and take a perspective on them that correspond to normal perception, they are not, they are a limited subset of projection. So that regularizes the problem. Whereas imagination, I can take any stance. It's just a full-blown group of projective transformation. And I can imagine any fantasy world, it doesn't matter. Imagination tends to be freer from physical constraint. And the good thing about this projective geometry is that if I imagine how it is like to be sitting at your place and that you are looking at me, or if I imagine the motion I need to do, I then have the rules for the motion itself, because they are embedded in those matrices. And with some calibration through the cerebellum, with the real world, for instance, if I move a lot, how much of that projective space will change, then we can actually build robots that will imagine their actions, fantasize their action, and program their action based on that, somewhat exactly the way we do. And there is a body in the space that is a virtual body. Think about phantom limbs at the center of this space. It's a projection. And the next time I'll talk to you about the prediction, the phenomena and paradox that are explained. We can explain, for instance, the paradox of these origins that have puzzled philosophers that doesn't seem to be in the center of the head. We have this projection system, and we cannot find in this space where it originate. It's normal. A projective space needs to exclude the origin to be built in a higher dimension. It's a necessary consequence of being a projective machine. Perspective illusion can be explained by that. Like the Necker cube. Why do you have this oscillation between those two ambiguous cubes? I could explain to you in detail why it arises from the theory. Proprioceptive illusion and out-of-body experiences. You know, when you see yourself through some manipulation with VR as an avatar, as a virtual avatar, and if you are touched really synchronously, you see the avatar being touched too, you will feel it's me. And you will feel you have two bodies. And it will be just like a perception, not just like an imagination. Well, that, again, can be explained by the fact that because the experimental situation is such, we have sense data that are conflicting, and the only projective transformation that can explain that is a projective transformation that normally belongs to imagination. But when the system has to make an inference, it will choose, okay, normally I don't use this transformation in perception, but the sense data, they force me to use it. So then, that's the best bet. And all of a sudden, something that was only imaginary become in the realm of perception. I will skip that. But know that in this projective space, there are very weird things. There is your body avatar somewhere beyond the infinity, beyond the horizon, beyond the glass, beyond the mirror. A lot of things could be explored into that are quite surprising. We can, of course, know that we have a theoretical model like Neurocomputational Hypotheses about the type of brain systems that are needed to implement them. And I'm going to skip that. Build robots. And I collaborate with ST Microelectronics to try to build a conscious robot based on these principles. And we'll skip that. And to finish with perspective, and let me apologize for having been so long with my horrible French accent. I lived 8 years in the US. I never lost it, never. And I had Dan Tranel tell me, oh, you know, David, maybe you should take class of accent reduction. Sorry. So, based on this idea that I kind of really sketched for you, a future for formal psychological science may include exploring the solution of projective geometry in the context of active inference. Maybe here we have a beginning of a theory of the mind that is actually mathematical, and therefore clinical practices could be perhaps, including fostering mentalization and resilience based on this concept, eventually, once we work them out, because wouldn't we benefit to understanding the system, the mechanics of the system, as Freud tried before us, as a reference, so it works, can fail, or can be enhanced. In my acknowledgement, we'll go to Jacques Lacan. Because all what I said, he actually theorized it. He was the one to understand that the imaginary is actually based on projective geometry. Much people don't know it. And his graph of desire is nothing but Bayesian inference combined with projective geometry. Tomorrow, we'll be able to make mathematical models and perhaps robots that will be Lacanian robots. My first robot will be called Jacques. And this idea that since we access the real indirectly, and we make the link between the symbolic, propositional knowledge, let's say, and the real through the imaginary. That's the idea of Lacan. This is exactly what it is. This Bayesian machine coupled with projective geometry, and that are trying to make inference about the world that is fundamentally uncertain based on internal model by taking all possible perspective, imagining things. That's what they do. And I'll tell you someday about the theory of the unconscious. Because I think through this type of mathematics, we can actually understand very naturally how the divided subject can emerge. It's a necessity, in fact. It's a necessity. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much.